Hello, second grade. It's Mrs. Chernitza, and I am recording your library lesson because we will not be doing our lessons by Zoom right now. So everybody that's staying virtual at home learning, resource is going to record the lessons. And then I'm going to post it on the Google Classroom. And then you guys can, whenever you're able to, take your time and you can watch the lesson. Um, so that's kind of nice. You can do it whenever you want and take as much time as you want. So let's go ahead and get started. Making connections, and we have talked about this in other lessons that we've had for library. If you remember, Miss T told you making connections is when you read a story or somebody reads a story to you and it might remind you of something about yourself or your family, or maybe of another story that you read about. So that's what making connections is when you read, it reminds you of something. Okay, so our learning intention is I can make text to text or text to self connections when I read a story. And we're going to talk in a few minutes about exactly what text to text and text to self means. And the success is that I will complete a text connection sorting activity. And it's pretty cool. I think you guys are going to like it. And remember, your learning intention is what Miss T wants you to learn from the lesson. And success is what you'll be able to do after the lesson. Okay, so let's talk about why reading is important. And if you remember in our last lessons, we talked about a few reasons why reading was important, about exercising your brain, and things like that. But also, it's important because you can find answers when you read to questions that you might have. It also can show other people's ideas, and it also makes you smarter and it can help you learn things. How do good readers better understand stories? So, when you become even better readers, the older that you get, it's going to help you better understand what you're reading. And some of the ways of doing that is the first one is choose books that are just right. So if you choose books, and we talked about this, that are just right for you, that's going to help you grow as a reader and you're going to become even better readers. Make and confirm predictions. And we've done this also with some of the stories that we've listened to. You might predict while you're reading it, something that's going to happen or something that the character is going to do. And confirming that means, did the character do what you thought they were going to do? Or did what you thought was going to happen, did it happen? Finding words that you don't know and figuring out what they mean. So a lot of times, and this it has a lot to do with choosing books that are just right, you might come across a word that you don't understand or you don't know the meaning of it. And that's fine. That's part of learning and becoming and growing as a reader. And you can always stop reading wherever you're at, and you can always look up the meaning of the word, and that will help you. You'll learn a new word and it will help you understand what you're reading better. And making connections, which is what we're talking about today. It helps you better understand what you're reading. And if you can read aloud fluently, so the more fluent you can read, which means you just kind of you can continue reading and that somebody can understand you and you don't stop a lot, like you're not saying read aloud fluently. So reading aloud fluently would be just like that. If Miss T read the last sentence, read aloud fluently. And I'm stopping at the period like I'm supposed to before I would start my next sentence. And that's reading aloud fluently. And that also can help you better understand your stories. You're not just continuing to read and making it sound like it's a run-on sentence. So those are some important things about how good readers better understand their stories. Okay, so making connections with our reading. It's not just about looking at the words. So, Miss T, even you guys could open up a book and you could look at the words. And if you know all the words, that's great. But just knowing the words and being able to read the words, it's not going to do you any good if you don't understand what you're reading. And making connections with what you're reading, that's what it's all about. When you make those connections, it helps you better understand what you're reading. It's not just you're reading it just to be able to say, I can read this book or I can read this page. because if you don't understand what you're reading, it's not going to do you any good. So making connections is one of those strategies that will help you do that. So today I'm going to show you a strategy that good readers use to help them understand the stories that they read and remember what they read. That's really important too, is remembering what you read. Okay, so we're going to listen to this video called Text Connections, and Miss T might stop it once in a while just to talk to you about the different types of connections and to make sure that you understand it. So let's go ahead and get started.
Hey, do you like to play with connecting blocks? Most kids do. It's so fun to take two things and connect them together. The blue block and the green block fit together perfectly. Did you know that you can connect or put things together when you read too? Good readers make connections when they read. There are three main ways to do this. The first way is a text to self connection. Have you ever read something that reminded you of you and your life? For example, if you read about Janie falling off of her bike, it might remind you about a time you fell off your bike. Because you know what it is like to fall off your bike, you can better understand how Janie feels or what might happen next in the story. Let's read about Henry. Henry loved getting ice cream. He was so happy that Grandma was taking him for a treat. He ordered his favorite, strawberry. Then, the worst thing that could happen happened. The nice round ball of ice cream fell off his cone and hit the ground with a splat.
So think about it. You could probably make a connection with this. Think about a time when you might have dropped a snack on the floor, and because you dropped it, you weren't able to eat it. How did you feel about it? You probably felt sad, just like Henry does. So that's a way that you can make a connection with stories.
Did reading that remind you of anything that's ever happened to you? If it did, you made a text to self connection. Maybe you've dropped your ice cream before. We call this text to self because the text reminded you of yourself. The second kind of connection is called text to text. This is when one text reminds you of another. You might read one story and say to yourself, hey, that reminds me of a part in another book. Let's read more about Henry. Donnie saw what happened. He felt sorry for Henry, so he said, I will share my ice cream with Henry. Did that remind you of another text? It reminded me of another story I read about sharing. Look at the second book. Julia saw that Josh did not have a treat. She decided to share hers with him. When Donnie shared with Henry, it reminded me of Julia sharing with Josh. The third kind of connection connects the text to the world, and we call this a text to world connection. When we say world, we mean anything going on around you. It can't be something that happened to you, because then it would be a text to self connection. But it can be something that reminds you of someone you know, your mom, your brother, a cousin, your dog. Or maybe it reminds you of a place like a school or a park. When what we read makes us think of something and it's not ourselves or another book, that is a text to world connection. Boys enjoyed the ice cream together, and when it was done, they picked up a baseball and played catch. Grandma smiled because she liked to see Henry feeling happy. Does that remind you of something in this world? It reminds me of watching my brother toss the baseball around the yard. It doesn't remind me of something that happened to me, and it doesn't remind me of another book. But since it does remind me of my brother, someone in my world, it's a text to world connection. His grandma smiling at him also reminds me of when my grandma smiles at my little cousin. Making connections when you read is fun because you get to think about what you know. And when you think about what you know, it helps you understand a story better. This is a great reading strategy, and you should practice doing this when you read. Let's review. Today, you learned that a text to self connection is when a text reminds you of your own life, yourself. A text to text connection is when a text reminds you of another text. And a text to world connection is when a text reminds you of something in the world. So go pick up a book and start reading. Make those connections. You will understand your book better and become a better reader at the same time.
Okay, good job, guys. So that told us the three different connections. It told us about text to self, which means when we read a story, it might remind us of something that happened to us, to ourselves. The second one is text to text, which means, and text is like another word for a book, for a story. So you might read a story and then it might remind you of another story that you read. And that can help you to better understand what you're reading. Then there's text to world. And what that means, again, is that you're making a connection with something that is in your world, like your family, where you live, the school you go to. It might remind you of somewhere that you visited or like the grocery store, somewhere that you go with your family. So that's what it means when it's a text to world connection. It's your world. It has to do with what your family or where you visit. Okay, good job. Now I want you guys to listen to the story Peter's Chair. And I think some of you might be able to make connections with the story, especially if you're an older sibling, if you have like a younger brother or a younger sister, or you might have more than one younger sibling. So you'll be able to make connections with this story. So let's see what happens with Peter and his younger sibling.
Peter's Chair, written and illustrated by Ezra Jack Keats. Peter stretched as high as he could. There, his tall building was finished. Crash! Down it came. Shh! Called his mother. You'll have to play more quietly. Remember, we have a new baby in the house.
So you might be able to make a connection with this. One connection could be when you're playing with your toys, and maybe if you guys have a pet and the pet knocks it down, that might remind you of that. Or it could remind you of maybe if you have younger siblings when they were babies and everybody had to be quiet in the house because the baby was sleeping. So that's how you can make text connections. And those would be, it wouldn't be text to self, but it would be text to world because you might remember something like that you had to be quiet because your baby brother or your baby sister were sleeping. And so that's somebody in your world. Or if your pet knocks over your blocks or your toys, that's something in your world.
Peter looked into his sister Susie's room. His mother was fussing around the cradle. That's my cradle, he thought. And they painted it pink. Hi, Peter, said his father. Would you like to help paint Sister's high chair? It's my high chair, whispered Peter.
So you might be able to make connections with this also, where mom or dad have to pay a little more attention because your younger brother or sister is just a baby. So they need a little bit more attention than you do. So you might be able to make that connection. And things that your mom and dad used when you were a baby, they might use now that they have another baby in the house. And that might be a connection that you can make too, remembering things that they used for you that they used for your younger brother or sister?
He saw his crib and muttered, "My crib. It's painted pink, too." Not far away stood his old chair. "They didn't paint that yet," Peter shouted. He picked it up and ran to his room. "Let's run away, Willie," he said. Peter filled a shopping bag with cookies and dog biscuits. "We'll take my blue chair, my toy crocodile, and the picture of me when I was a baby." Willie got his bone. They went outside and stood in front of his house. "This is a good place," said Peter. He arranged his things very nicely and decided to sit in his chair for a while. But he couldn't fit in the chair. He was too big. His mother came to the window and called, "Won't you come back to us, Peter dear? We have something very special for lunch." Peter and Willie made believe they didn't hear, but Peter got an idea.
That part of the story when Peter couldn't fit in his chair anymore, you know what? Mrs. T was actually I was able to make a connection with that. I still have a little rocking chair that my grandmother had at her house that as a little girl, I would always sit in it and I would rock and I would play with it. And then the older I got, I would always go to my grandmother's house and I would try to sit in that chair. And finally, it got to where I was just too big to fit in it. And so that reminded me of the time when my grandmother had that rocking chair and I used to play with it.
Soon his mother saw signs that Peter was home. "That rascal is hiding behind the curtain," she said happily. She moved the curtain away, but he wasn't there. "Here I am!" shouted Peter. Peter sat in a grown-up chair. His father sat next to him. "Daddy," said Peter, "let's paint the little chair pink for Susie." And they did.
That was a really cute story. And it's okay to be a little bit jealous if you're the older sibling and there's a baby in the house. Because, like Miss T said, mom and dad have to pay a little more attention to the baby, and they might have to use things that they used to use with you for the baby. So it's totally normal to be a little jealous. And it's totally normal to feel like, I just want to run away. Nobody wants me around, but they do. And when he realized that he was growing and that he was too big for the chair, he realized what a big boy he was and that he needed to be the big brother and that he needed to help dad paint the chair for his little sister. And I am sure that you guys maybe made connections with that too, because I have a younger sister, and I remember when I was little, I was about your age when my little sister was born, and I can remember my mom having to take care of her and feed her a bottle, and she needed things that they had used for me, and I realized that I was the big sister and that I needed to help her. So I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope that you were able to make connections with the story. And that was a really good story. Okay, so now we are going to do a making connections activity together. Okay, what it's going to do is it's going to read a little piece of a story, and then we're going to see if we can make connections with it. And this will be good practice.
It was a hot summer's day, and there was no breeze. Linda wanted to open the window, but it was stuck. Instead, she walked out of the house.
Okay, so let's see if we can make a connection.
That reminds me of when I spent the day playing in the sun. I was so hot.
Okay, so up here it talks about how it was a hot summer's day. There was no breeze, so she needed to go out of the house. Here it says, it reminds her of when she spent the day playing in the sun. I was so hot. So, is that a text-to-text connection? Is it making a connection between a story and a story? No, good job. What about text to world? Is it making a connection from this text to something in her world? No, good job. What about, is it making a connection between the text and something that happened to her? Yes, good job, because it's reminding her of a time when she was outside and it was really hot.
Correct.
Good job.
That reminds me of when I read about the different seasons in a year.
Okay, so let's look. Up here it talks about a hot summer's day. And then here it talks about the seasons, and summer's one of the seasons. And if you look, we have a little hint when I read about the different seasons. So is that going to be a connection between the story to another story or text to text? Because up here it talked about the seasons, and here it talks about the seasons. But when I read, which means it's a book. So yes, good job. Text to text.
Correct. That reminds me of a story my friend told me about trying to open a window, and when he turned the crank too hard, it shattered.
Okay, so let's look. So up here it talks about that Linda wanted to open the window, but it was stuck. Well, this is reminding the person about their friend who told them about a story about their window when they tried opening that it broke. So is that a story, a text to another text connection? No, it doesn't say anything about it reminding them something about a book. What about text to world? Because it does say it reminds them about somebody in their world, their friend, that told them a story about something that happened to them. So yes, I think the connection would be text to world.
Correct.
Good job.
That reminds me of the time we brought home a turtle.
Okay, so this talks about being really hot, not being able to open the window, so that she walked outside to get the breeze. Does that have any connection to bringing home a turtle at all? No, good job. So Miss T is going to put
Correct.
no connection. Good job. Okay, let's try another one.
My dad and I were solving math puzzles. My dad is very smart and he loves math. I am a little scared of numbers, but with Dad by my side, I was having fun.
Okay, let's see what kind of connections we can make with this.
That reminds me of the time when my mom and I did math homework.
Okay, so this talks about her and her dad doing math puzzles. And then here it says that it reminds her about doing her math homework with her mom. So is it making a connection between a story and another story? No, because this isn't talking about a book. What about text to world? No, because it's talking about her doing her math homework. How about text to self? Because it's reminding her about when she did her homework.
Correct.
Good job.
That reminds me of the time when I solved math puzzles from a library book.
Okay, so up here it talks about my dad and I solving math puzzles, and then here it says it reminds the person of a time when they solved math puzzles, but it was from a library book. So that's your clue, library book. So is the connection a text to text? Is it between here that was in a text and another story or another book? And yes, it is, because it says library book. Good job.
Correct. That reminds me of a time I read a story about numbers fighting with each other.
Okay, so this talks about that she's a little scared of numbers, And then here it talks about it reminds her of a time when she read a story about numbers. So there is a connection because it talks about numbers, but the connection, it says read a story about numbers fighting. So there's our clue, read a story. So would that be a connection text to text? Yes, it would. Good job. Because it talks about numbers up here, and down here it talks about reading a story about numbers. So it's reminding us about something from a book.
Correct!
Good job.
That reminds me of the afternoon I took a long nap.
Okay, so this is talking about solving math puzzles and being a little scared about numbers. This is talking about taking a nap. Does one have anything to do with the other? Would there be any connection in there? What do you think? If you said no, then you are completely right. There is no connection between the two.
Correct!
Okay, let's do one more and then we'll be done.
Liz was homesick one day, and she was bored of lying on her bed. She sat up and looked out of the window. Spring was just beginning, and yellow flowers were growing in the field outside.
Okay, so let's see if there's any connections we can make.
That reminds me of the time I read a book about how flowers grow in the spring.
Okay, so this is talking about it being spring and yellow flowers are growing outside. This talks about that it reminds someone about a time they read a book about flowers growing in the spring. So what clue do we have here? We have a clue that it reminded them about something they read in a book. So we'll know it's text to text, right? Because we're taking something that was in a book or in a text, in a story, and it reminded us about something else that was in a book.
Correct!
Good job.
That reminds me of the time Mom and Dad bought yellow flowers for Grandma when she was sick.
Okay, so it says Liz was homesick and she was bored of lying in her bed, so she looked out the window and she saw the flowers growing in the field. Down here it says it reminds someone of a time that their mom and dad bought yellow flowers for Grandma when she was sick. Well, let's see. Is that a text to text? Does this remind the person down here of something from a story in a book? No, good job. It doesn't say anything down here about it being from a story. What about text to world? And remember, text to world is when it reminds you of something that's in your world, like your family or where you live or your school or somewhere that you take a trip. So yes, it would be text to world because this reminds you about something about your family. It's about your mom and dad giving yellow flowers to your grandma when she was sick. And your mom and dad and your grandma would be something in your world.
Correct!
Good job.
That reminds me of the time I broke my leg and had to stay home.
Okay, so it says she was sick and had to stay home. And this says it reminds her of a time she broke her leg and had to stay home. Well, breaking your leg, that's just like being sick, right? And Liz had to lie in her bed, and this person down here had to stay at home. So is that text to text? Does this have anything about reminding her of something that was in a story? No, good job. What about text to world? Well, it doesn't really talk about anybody in her world, like her family or a place that she knows. What about text to self? Yes, I think you're right, because this is talking about it reminding her of something about herself, that her leg broke and she had to stay at home.
Correct!
Good job.
That reminds me of the time I wore 2 different socks to school.
That's silly. That's happened to Miss T before when she's been really in a hurry in the morning or even wearing 2 different shoes. But does wearing 2 different socks, is there any connection between that and being sick and seeing flowers outside your window? What do you think? If you said no, you're right. There's no connection there. So we will click no connection.
Correct!
Okay, guys, excellent. Good job. You guys are so smart. All right, so That is our lesson for today. We talked about making connections, the 3 types of connections, did practicing to see if there were connections between parts of a story and things that people were reminded of, and you guys did such a good job. So this is it till next time. I want you guys to stay good, do your job, do your schoolwork, listen to your parents, listen to your teacher, and Miss T will see you next time.